Everyone will make their way to their seats. We'll get started. And we did have a comment that some of the panel members are not, people can't hear them in the room. So really, like someone said yesterday, snuggle up with that microphone, please. Okay, that was Dr. Blask. Okay, so now we're going to get into our favorite topic here of sleep and other exposures. And Dr. Twerry from NHLBI is going to lead this session.
Okay, thank you very much. With this session, I'd like to point out that we're moving to a shorter format. We have 45 minutes instead of hours. There are no presentations. This session is to identify relevant exposures that coincide with night shift work and exposure to artificial light at night and determine whether those co-exposures should be treated as confounders or effect modifiers in human studies. So this is a topic that certainly has come up already, and I'm sure through the discussion in the next four question items, it will follow the same format as this morning. I'll introduce the discussion question, and then there is a panel of or four members of the panel will be invited to comment. Because we only have 45 minutes, the time per question will be shortened accordingly. So I have my iron fist and timer ready. Without any further ado, what is the relationship of sleep, meal timing, and circadian disruption? And Janet, Dr. Hall from NIEHS is first on up to comment.
So I think we've heard a little bit about this already, and that is that they actually are very integrated, and we have to think about them, or we can't think about one independently of the other. And I think that as we talk about, animal models of shift work and things like that, I think it's really important that becomes a part of what's done. And I know that there have been attempts to coordinate that already, but I think we maybe don't know enough about different types of shift work and how that affects particularly meal timing. I think we know a little bit about how it affects sleep, although probably not completely, because it's going to be somewhat dependent on the different occupational exposures, the different occupations, because different individuals or different kinds of jobs require different kinds of activity at night. So I think that again, as we start, I think that Dr. Van Vermeulen had mentioned that one of the things we actually need is to really get down more into the weeds a little bit about the specifics of the changes that occur with shift work, and not just assume that all shift work is the same, because that may very well make a difference in terms of what our outcomes are, given that we're not always 100% sure what the intermediary phenotype of those, or what the intermediary cause of those outcomes is. So I think that it's going to really help us a little bit more if some of our human studies can be just more granular in terms of thinking about that. So I really agree with what you had said before about that. I think that it's going to be really critical if we're going to try to understand how they all come together.
All right, thank you, Janet. And Dr. Panda from Salk Institute.
Yeah, I think when it comes to meal timing and sleep disruption, they go hand in hand. One thing is, although we say that nearly 10 to 15% of the genome in liver is circadianly regulated or show a diurnal rhythm, a vast majority of those are actually driven by food. For example, we did a systematic study in mice where we did not give food to mice for 24 hours, and we find only 400 gene cycle, whereas if they have ad libitum access to normal chow, that number jumps to 3,000. So that simply said that nearly 70 to 80% cyclers are driven by food. So in that context, meal timing becomes much more important because a lot of these rhythms are driven, I would not say completely driven, but there is a synergistic interaction between meal timing and clock. The second thing that happens with meal and clock is most of the food actually has xenobiotics or bioactive molecules that can act on circadian clock. And the best example is caffeine, which has been shown recently to act actually on the clock in a cell autonomous manner. So now if we think of time of caffeine intake, or in general public, there is misunderstanding of what is caffeine. For example, many people don't consider energy drinks as caffeinated drinks. So now if we include chocolate chip cookies, caffeine, and caffeine present in various ice creams or other stuff, then we can clearly see that meal timing, circadian disruption go hand in hand. And actually, it's not a modifier but or confounder, but it acts synergistically. Let me see what else I have. So along the same line, there are also other bioactive molecules. For example, nearly 80% of US adults take some kind of supplements, and nearly 30 to 40% take some kind of medication. So then the question is, how do these medications affect clock, and how conversely how clock affects medication efficacy. So just going on how medications affect clock, that itself is very interesting, and we haven't actually extensively studied that. So I'll just stop there, and then maybe during the subsequent questions we can discuss more.
Thank you. Dr. Smolensky.
I'll try to be as brief as possible. It's not easy. First of all, my experiences with meal timing and shift work is unfortunately restricted to human beings. And two aspects, but I only talk about one. In Europe, early in my youth, was asked to help reorganize with Dr. Reinberg a shift work schedule of petroleum operators. And the plants involved, the administrators didn't care as long as the works was covered. And it was interesting that the workers wanted the shift schedule to be designed, it's a rotating shift schedule, so they could have at least one meal on each shift at home, either a breakfast or a lunch, depending on the shift, or a dinner. And I found that really unique. My experience in the United States is not related to meal timing, the schedule being developed, that is, or arranged, but how much time they could get in for overtime, how much money they could get, and how much free time they could get, either to play or to have a second job. So I think there are some cultural issues that relate to meal timing. And then the other thing, as Fred and everybody else has talked about, is when we did the study on those French workers, they were willing to self-measure and keep food diaries when they went through their shift schedule. And that was our first inkling that when people were on the night shift, they just continually noshed and nourished on carbohydrates and fatty foods as snacks, and not really a major meal. It just, when you plot the data, it was interesting. The second thing with regard to sleep and meal timing is what I'd like to do is go back to early childhood and neonatalhood, if you will. It's interesting that the sleep-wake sleep-wake rhythm at first is not developed into circadian, but more ultradian, and then how our infants nurse. Well, they're either breastfed or formula-fed initially, depending on culture or prerogatives or time or conflicts. But I do know that that many women are pumping during the day, including my wife was, so that I or others, or caretakers in case of other babies, could be using the breast milk that's pumped during the day for use in the nighttime. The problem is for women who are not available at night because they're doing shift work or what have you, or they're fatigued, there are many other issues, or it's just a decision made by the couple, is that daytime breast milk is devoid of melatonin and tryptophan and other chemicals, natural chemicals that would help induce the induction of sleep and further and more proper rapid development of the circadian sleep-wake schedule. So I guess what I'm saying, there is perhaps some already model there for a type of meal timing scenario and disrupted sleep in a neonatal setting. And unfortunately, that's still a problem today. So one other point is the use of beta blockers. Beta blockers, not food, obviously, but it's a chemical. And I remember when I was younger and propranolol came out as a beta blocker, and all the male faculty were hypertensive, and they were taking beta blockers twice a day because we didn't have long-active drugs. And most of them were depressed, most of them were not sleeping well, and whether they had obesity beforehand or not, I don't know, but they were all gaining weight and becoming type 2 diabetics. So there, again, that can inhibit, we know from acute studies so far, melatonin and perhaps secondary sleep. So I'll be quiet.
Thank you, Michael. So for Kyla, I'd like to suggest that we add a note kind of building on what Mike just told us, and that is that the timing of medications might be a variable, since we're talking about medications and supplements affecting sleep, but the timing of those medications and supplements, there may be a safer time to take them. Just thought. Okay.
Biological time.
Yeah, biological time. I'm sorry. Fred? Dr. Turek is next.
Yeah, I'll try to talk as long as possible or until Mike stops me. No, I think,
You have 1 minute.
yeah, no, I won't take long. Because the advantage of going last is some things I was going to say have been said, and I may just say them in a different way. To me, it's a two-way street. I mean, it isn't like, are they confounders? Circadian disruption and meal timing and sleep, that's really the crux of external desynchronization, is when you have these major, sometimes I go to a meeting and I talk about master circadian clock, suprachiasmatic nucleus, master circadian rhythm, sleep. However, if I'm talking before the Nutrition Society, the master circadian rhythm is the feeding rhythm. Depends on who I'm talking to. And something that with the circadian people, we're kind of keeping this under the table, so I probably shouldn't tell people. But it turns out that, we were beating our chest when we found out that 30 to 40 to 50% of all gene expression is cycling. So if the heart has 3,000 genes that are being expressed, 300 genes are about 300, 600, 900, there's some debate. Well, just recently it's been shown that if we don't let the person sleep, a lot of those cycling genes aren't cycling anymore. So the sleep is driving. And then if we, to go on with Sancho was saying, if we take meal out of it too, if we said, it'd be interesting to have somebody who kept awake for 24 hours, didn't give them any food for 24 hours, we might only have the clock genes, maybe the only ones left cycling. So that's a point that I wanted to make. I also wanted to make the point that this chronic desynchronization, we could set up a Framingham study, and in 50 years we'd have an answer as to whether or not it's leading to cancer and so on. So I think that really tells me we've got to do epidemiological studies where we're going out there and looking at large numbers of people doing one thing, large numbers of people doing something else, and seeing if that's linked to the disease states that we're interested in. In terms of meal timing, you did mention the fact that you noticed this in, you called them Europeans, but they were French. Let's be. And of course, they were going to be concerned about their having a meal, It's now that, Van Carter's done clinical studies where she's, sleep deprived, only let the individual sleep 4 hours a night for 6 days, and she finds out, like you said, they're munching and they're really taking in high fat. Karen Spiegel had that paper a few years ago. They're taking in all the wrong foods, a lot of salt. And in fact, I went out to Quaker Oats about 30 years ago and tried to get them to design, because we haven't talked too much about this, a line of chocolate, like Chrono chocolate. That was my joke with them. But are they making food for people who are eating in the middle of the night? In other words, when that lunch wagon, I've worked in summers when I was in college, when that lunch wagon comes by at 3 in the morning, it's got the same food on it as the lunch wagon. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be easy to change the behavior of the factory workers, which is what I was, but nevertheless, we probably need much more education as to, one reason you may have more gastrointestinal problems has less to do with circadian and sleep loss and more having to do with eating a greasy hamburger at 3 o'clock in the morning. So I think that's an issue. And then I'll just end with the sleeping at the wrong time of day. We've mentioned it once or twice, but I really think that is I've worked with the Coast Guard and with the barge industry, and the barge industry they have to be working 24 hours. So the pilot and captain is 6-6-6-6, and the Coast Guard wanted to switch them to 8-8-4-4, figuring now you'd have 8 hours to sleep. You get your 8 hours of sleep, and I said no. If you try to sleep between, I'd say 8 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you will not sleep 8 hours. You're lucky to get 4 hours, 4 or 5 hours in, and then there won't be enough time for a nap. So that just came out in the Federal Registrar, where the Coast Guard said we want them to switch, and then I had a response that I did not want them to switch, and they're not switching. So I think we need to think more about the fact that you can't sleep, and then if you are trying to sleep in the middle of the day, you've got to educate the wife, the children, that don't be calling them, don't be sending him to get the car fixed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when he's trying to sleep. So a lot of this is education. And the issue of smoke, and then I'll quit, was about 10 years smoking. About 10 years ago, I was at a meeting in which I was told, I didn't know this, that 50% of Americans used to smoke. Now it's 25%. And I wanted to say, oh, gee, that's really bad. We still have 25% smoking. And they all looked at me and said, you don't understand. To change behavior that much in a short period of time took a lot of education and a lot of pressure against the industry and that. So I think a lot of what we're talking about here, too, is educating people. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Fred. One reason I let Fred go on is because I'm going to add a question here. I'm going to ask the panel members to comment on a recently published finding where a well-known sleep circadian researcher went into tribal environments. I think everyone knows where there is no artificial light, and monitored their sleep. And so I'd like to invite any of the four discussants, or actually anyone on the panel, I guess, for this one, whether they think that has a bearing on this question, on the discussion of with regard to the relationship of sleep and circadian timing.
Yes. In fact, that result is now opening up a lot of questions, because from the best we knew, based on studies like by Tom Ware, where he took people and put them on 14 hours of light, 10 hours of darkness, or put them on 10 hours of light, 14 hours of darkness. So when you had like 14 hours of darkness, they slept about 10 to 11 hours in 2 bouts. So that's the split sleep that you probably heard a lot about, first sleep, second sleep, and then the historian from Virginia, he wrote a book actually on the topic of how we slept in the Middle Ages, and split sleep was seen as the pattern that when the sun set, you were asleep for 4 or 5 hours, you'd wake up for 2 or 3 hours, walk around the village, no lights, but and then you go back to sleep. So we're all under the impression that we need, you would sleep 9 to 10 hours, and then the study comes out in these 3 Aboriginal populations, and it seemed to me that a lot of that was linked to temperature. So I think it's bad. It's very difficult to sleep in 80 degrees.
So I brought it up because this was Jerry Siegel's study,
Yeah.
if you don't know. So I figure almost everyone in the room will know that. But it was just published in 2015. Right?
Yeah, just published.
Yeah. So because here's a study where they did a detailed investigation of several community settings where there was no artificial light, and they made some important observations. I'm not sure we all agree with Fred's interpretation or Jerry's interpretation, but I think it points to that the evidence base is still evolving. It's still growing, and there's many, go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I looked at that real carefully because I was so interested in it. And the mean actual sleep time was between 5.5 and 7 hours, with a WASO, that is wake after sleep onset, of an hour. So there was the biphasic sleep. And I hate to pick a fight with you on this, and I'm not picking a fight, but.
Yeah, there's no time
No,
for
but
fights
This
today.
matters. This is a big topic. Thomas Ware's work, under 14 hours, it was 8.5 hours of confirmed sleep. Mean, 8.5 out of that 14. This is a very important distinction.
Well, yeah.
So-
when
so-
they went in, they were sleeping like 9, 10, 11 hours, and that was his response was they're all sleep deprived. But then I thought it plateaued at 9. I'm not going to argue with you.
No, it's okay.
So Richard and Fred, I only brought it up to highlight the fact
Start
that
a
we're.
fight here. What are you doing?
Yeah, right. I mean, but it does, I think this conversation highlights that this is still an area of active investigation. They're important questions. And I don't want to, because we have a shorter time than the other groups a little bit. I know that I have my own schedule.
I think it's a, wait,
Well, one last comment. Mariana is going to throw in a yes or no.
Maybe. Well, I actually think that there was one component between these two studies. I mean, one is a lab study where you actually don't have anything to do. You're sitting in the lab, may as well sleep. The other one, they got to survive wherever they are. So there are, again, the social and the obligations you have to do in real life that may interfere with sleep.
Thank you, Mariana. I'd like to move on, but
Just quick.
okay.
Yeah. So I think the underlying thought process is whatever these tribal Aboriginal people are doing is good for health, but there is no evidence to say that people who are living in the wild with average life expectancy of 40 years or 45 years, whatever they are doing is good for modern people.
So what's on? There's a lot more details in that study, and we can discuss it offline, or someone can email me. I'm not hard to find at NIH. So twery@nih.gov if you want to send me an opinion. Next question for this group of discussants: what health outcomes are potentially related to sleep duration and quality? And so we have about 11 minutes in the schedule for each question. So that's about 2 and a fraction minutes per discussant. And what I'd like you to focus on is this potentially related to sleep duration and quality. Independent, right? We're not talking about rhythm here. And what can you attribute to sleep duration and quality in the evidence base? And so, Janet, you have you're first on the list.
Okay, so I actually wanted to take this time to talk probably the most that I'm going to talk here because as you know, I'm very interested in reproductive things. And reproduction actually is very much affected by external cues. And there's been a lot of discussion and question about whether things like shift work make a difference in terms of reproductive health. But I wanted to make one point, and that is that we are sort of thinking about circadian and sleep as though it's a 24-hour period, and that every 24-hour period is equivalent. But across the menstrual cycle, that's actually not true, because at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, there is a period of time where sleep specifically decreases the activity of the GnRH pulse generator, which is necessary, obviously, for gonadotropin secretion. And so that's a period of time that is potentially particularly susceptible to disruption. So if we think about women who are working shifts, they may be doing just fine if they've got their shifts, in the luteal phase or in the late follicular phase or something. But during that transition from one cycle to the next, when FSH levels are rising and you're recruiting follicles, that's an incredibly sensitive time. And so I think that that's something that, at least for reproductive health, we need to keep in mind. And it actually may explain some of the variability in responses that we see in large studies where those things aren't tracked as well.
Thank you, Janet. Dr. Panda.
But I had one other thing to say.
I'm sorry.
May I? The other thing I wanted to mention, sorry about that, is that that sleep is an incredibly important thing for puberty. So that another thing that we need to be thinking about as we talk about what are the effects of sleep on reproductive health is what are the effects of sleep disruption or sleep truncation, and how is that going to affect puberty, and how does that affect downstream things? So that was just the other one point that I wanted to make, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Okay, so I'll not actually talk about sleep duration and sleep fragmentation and health outcome, but I'll talk about what confounding factors can come in, because we cannot really separate circadian disruption from sleep. So in the recent study, we time-stamped when people were eating, and what was interesting was nearly 80% of people in our cohort, adult people, they ate something, calorie-containing food, within 1 hour of waking up. Nearly 50% ate something within 2 hours of going to bed. And in the middle of the night, whenever they woke up, many people actually took a bite. So the concern here is when people are studying sleep duration and sleep fragmentation and connecting that to health outcome, then most of the studies have discounted the eating duration or eating pattern. So this eating pattern and sleep duration, sleep quality do closely interact. So all these health outcomes have to be now considered, which health outcomes are result of short sleep duration or increased eating duration.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. Dr. Smolensky.
I think I'd like to approach this, your answer in two ways. Do you want us, the well-known issues about sleep disorders and so forth, but getting away from sleep disordered breathing or leg movement during sleep, periodic leg movement, just let's talk about individuals who have, with age, nocturia. And they wake up at night to urinate. And from my own experience and that of my wife, it turns on a light. And sometimes have trouble going back to sleep right away, so sleep becomes fragmented. We don't know, at least I don't know, there have been some studies, but now we have ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, and we ought to be looking at what sleep disruption or sleep fragmentation, sleep quality, sleep duration, even sleep architecture, how that plays a role in, if we get away even from light at night effects, how that is impacting on sleep time blood pressure. Because more and more data are accumulating indicating that it's a sleep time blood pressure which is most linked to vascular risk, type 2 diabetes, new onset development, and other renal disease and other negative outcomes. So I guess what I'm saying is we don't know a lot of things, and if we go back into the literature and we do a literature review, we see that hypertension is defined, throughout 120/80. But if you look at the guidelines based on ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, they're far different. They're 135/85 for the wake time mean, and the sleep time mean is 120/70. And if we see that people fail to decrease their blood pressure during nighttime sleep, their risk, and based on outcome studies, there's several now that are large and well-powered, indicating it's a sleep time blood pressure that is most determined the subjective nighttime blood pressure, which is most related to negative outcomes in terms of cardiovascular and metabolic risk as well, and renal risk.
Thank you, Michael. Now, for Dr. Turek, I'd like you to specifically get at this idea. A lot of the answers have been in terms of the poor sleep. But what do we know about sleep health and sleep duration on these health outcomes?
Well, so the paper in 1999 of Spiegel and Van Carter, and that was the game changer for the field of sleep when they demonstrated that young, healthy, college-aged male students at the University of Chicago, when they only were allowed to sleep 4 hours a night for 6 nights, they showed signs of insulin resistance at the end of that time. She then went into, I still remember jogging with her and saying, oh, this is great. Now let's take some pre-diabetic people who have insulin resistance, sleep deprived, and see if we can get them into diabetes. then we said, maybe we better do an animal model on that one. And then she went into Hyde Park and got the short sleepers, less than 6.5 hours, 6.5, I can't remember, long sleepers, 7.5 or more, and showed they had insulin resistance, even though they didn't have diabetes. So I think the data from both clinical studies and then the epidemiological, because, Michael, they wouldn't let me talk about sleep. I pulled this slide out. This is in 2010, I'll give you guys a hard time. In 2010, there had been a total of 84 studies looking at sleep duration and obesity. 76 of them found that there was a relationship. The less you slept, the more obese you were. That was 28 out of 28 studies in children. So it wasn't even, you talk about an odds ratio or the p-value on that. And then, obviously 48 out of 56. So I think, Michael, I think that's well established. But I also think it's important, now Michael's really getting mad at me, I would have asked that question slightly differently. I would have had health outcomes, sleep duration, and then I would have an arrow going in both directions. And I think that's really important. It's not only that if you have sleep problems, how you're going to impact health, it's how your health problems impacting your sleep, which is then going to feed back on that. And in fact, I proposed today that we change the name of the National Center of Sleep Disorders Research, because that implies we're interested in sleep disorders, when I really think we should be interested, in addition, restless leg syndrome, apnea, and insomnia important, we really should be interested in how health outcomes, people who have fibromyalgia, have diabetes, have multiple sclerosis, have cardiovascular disease, how it's impacting their sleep, and then how is that then having a further adverse effect on, so the diabetes was not caused by sleep loss, but if you have sleep loss associated with diabetes, how does that affect the disorder? So I think I would call it the National Center on Sleep and Circadian Rhythms or something like that. You got to get circadian in there.
That's a really good point, Fred. But we just had to go to Congress, pass legislation. And I'll be happy to tell you about all my problems with that process.
I understand.
But I have a question for you. I think everyone or many of us in the room are familiar with Ev's, work there. My question in that regard is, so yes, young male volunteers were, spent shorter time in bed, but how much of that, the effect observed was mediated by rhythm disturbance as opposed to sleep disturbance?
Well, when she truncated it so that they slept 2 hours less on the front end and 2 hours less on the back end, trying to minimize the effect on the circadian clock system. Remember, I also said that she's now done the study showing that if she keeps sleep time constant, you only get 6 hours of sleep, and therefore you can get 6 hours if you've been sleep deprived, even if you're sleeping in the middle of the day, and shifts the clock, but the light-dark cycle, then you still get, I'll call it insulin resistance. And so both sleep loss itself and circadian disruption itself, I think, would be the party line now, can cause metabolic problems. And I thought you were going to ask me, well, what about other things? And no. That just hasn't been studied. But clearly in the metabolic world, both of those are involved. And I think your point that you just raised, and I had never thought of this before, what Michael was alluding to was, are you a dipper? So does your blood pressure dip at night? And it never occurred to me, what happens to shift workers who are sleeping during the day? Do they have dipping? Do you know that?
There's only been a couple of decent ambulatory 24-hour blood pressure studies that I know of. And basically what we saw was, and unfortunately it's presented as a group mean, is basically a level blood pressure without dipping. Now, that doesn't mean that some individuals, that's the problem with group studies. There are probably individuals who dip when they sleep during the day because they adjust well, and there probably is another group that doesn't. And we know really nothing, because it's not only the blood pressure, because when you dig deeper, just as you go to the molecular level, if you went to look at all the circadian underlying rhythms that control or regulate blood pressure 24-hour pattern, there's probably 10 to 12 hierarchy or high-level ones that are involved. The renin-angiotensin system, aldosterone system, the parasympathetic nervous system, the renal rhythms, many, many others, vascular rhythms, the cardiac rhythms. And then if you dig down deeper into the clock genes or clock control genes, when you just talk about blood pressure itself is a topic in terms of circadian dysregulation. So I think that it's not only the blood pressure per se, which is important because it's an extra strain against the vascular system, but it's what's going on underneath in terms of what is the molecular drivers that could be growth factors that change tissues, that renal tissue for renal disease, for heart disease, et cetera, et cetera. And that needs to be looked at in terms of shift work, in terms of sleep deprivation, because that's really key for developing new interventions in prevention medicine.
You know, I'll make it very quick. To even broaden what you just said, if you look at something like growth hormone, when 90% of your growth hormone is produced during the first 4 hours of your sleep. If you don't go to sleep, you don't produce growth hormone. If you go to sleep the next day at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, growth hormone comes up. And all the hormones have a different, so the clock may regulate 90% of the peak of thyroid hormone, but it only regulates 10% of growth hormone. So how all those different hormones, I'll just stick with those, let alone cytokines and that, how these other factors, how are affected by if you're sleeping at the wrong time of day, we're really not paying attention to.
Thank you, Fred. Janet has a comment.
I just had one comment in relation to both the point that Fred brought up earlier about sleep fragmentation, which we really haven't spent a whole lot of time talking about, and in terms of the points that Mike has just made regarding situations in which people get up at night a lot. This is something that's very classic of women who transition through menopause. But that specific fragmentation of sleep has been consistently related to increased heart rate variability, which is a marker of sympathetic tone. So, again, fragmentation may be slightly different than truncation, and we may end up needing to pay some attention to that as we look at health outcomes.
Thank you. For the notes, I just want to say that we should change sleep is needed to protect the pituitary hormones, including growth hormone, because it's, as Fred said, it's all of them. Go ahead.
No, the other point that we don't know, who is the other one? Oh, I was just going to add to Fred very briefly that there's other hormones that are not perhaps directly regulated by the pituitary, like the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. That seems to be it activates during the sleep span, and so that's another factor. Is over for one reason or another is over stimulation of that system, which leads to higher blood pressure at night, due to lack of sleep or circadian dysregulation or other factors that we'll get to. We really don't know. We really don't know.
Dr. Lund.
I just wanted to know what the literature is of sleep and cancer. I know we've been talking about this other stuff, but I care about it. And then also in terms of the epidemiological studies of shift work, how much information do they collect about sleep in the available studies that are?
Go ahead.
For our EPI studies, we collect information about sleep duration, also sleep quality, and as been indicated before, we're trying to get more objective information as well on the sleep in smaller subsets.
Your plan one, I understand, but what about the, like most of the studies that are available? I know that you're digging deeper than most of the available studies on lots of things.
For reported sleep duration, the first one was 1999 or 2000, I think, from Finland. Short sleep, higher risk of breast cancer. There have been 4 or 5 since then, cohort studies. This is reported by people. No polysomnography or any of that. And it's a much more mixed picture. I think most of them still show short sleep, higher risk compared to average. But the long sleep, no. That's all over the map. That's my impression.
So I know, I don't know if they want, but I have we want to get done by 2:30, and we have 2 questions left. So we have 50% left to go. So, yeah, so this has been very good discussion, and I have my own questions to ask you on this, but we'll move on. So, question number 3: what health outcomes are potentially related to decreased daylight vitamin D? Are shift workers likely to have vitamin D deficiency? And I'm going to I'm going to change the order here. Dr. Smolensky.
Thank you for the setup. I only know, I recently reviewed the literature, the published literature, and I don't know if anything has come out in the last month or so, but I didn't find very many studies on vitamin D deficiency in shift workers, and I think the one I did find indicated vitamin D deficiency. Now, having said that, what is vitamin D insufficiency or deficiency? Most of the regs for this are built on bone health. And I don't know, and we know, of course, I'm spilling over to the next question, but anyway, we know from what's published is that vitamin D plays a significant role in the immune system, cardiovascular system. It helps regulate blood pressure, acting as a hormone. It's vitamin D3. It also is oncostatic, and it does many, many things. And so I don't know what vitamin D levels are required for well-being and health. I only know what I read about bone health, and I don't know if those units are applicable or recommendations. But having said that, based upon the literature I reviewed for bone health, approximately 75% of Americans are vitamin D either insufficient or deficient. Some of the studies done in China are almost 100% of the cohorts that were studied. And in India, 90% of the men and a lesser percentage in women. So, but that's all based on bone health. And I really don't know what is optimal or thresholds for other negative outcomes. And before I finish up, from my perspective, I see vitamin D exposure in the real world for our ancestors or our humanoids before electric light as possibly being a reinforcing, synchronizing agent with vitamin UV radiation, I should say the 290 to 315 spectrum, causing the creation of vitamin D. And so at dawn, there isn't much of that radiation getting through the atmosphere because of the angle of the sun. So probably it would be like a couple hours after sunrise that you would start seeing some exposure to real significant UV radiation. I won't say UV, the spectrum of radiation required to generate vitamin D. And then through translational steps, we probably would get a peak a few hours later, and then vitamin D actually acts as a hormone, which activates in the nucleus RNA transcription and so forth. So I don't know the role of vitamin D. I'm just saying there is overlapping effects of vitamin D deficiency, which means that's sufficiency in terms of well-being, in terms of melatonin being created at night, acting synergistically for well-being and health. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Michael. So it turns out the current dietary supplement, I believe, is 2,000 units per day. And just to put this in a framework, NIH is currently, and has funded over the last decade, many clinical trials using anywhere up to 500,000 units IV to see if we can find some curative effects or some benefit from vitamin D beyond bone health. Okay, is it?
And? What's the result?
Those studies, there weren't any survivors? No. But I that's a whole nother discussion. Again, I'll take that offline. I'd be more than happy to gossip about vitamin D. Sir?
Just a quick comment about what Mike, just said about synergism between melatonin and vitamin D, that there may be this kind of yin and yang. Actually, there's some data. It's in vitro, and I just told you that I abhor in vitro data. Not abhor, but at any rate, Steve Hill, my colleague, showed some years ago that actually melatonin at a nighttime concentration and vitamin D do act synergistically on breast cancer, inhibiting breast cancer growth. So there may be something to that idea, particularly with respect to shift work and maybe losing the melatonin signal and leaving out this important synergistic effect.
Thank you. Certainly another day-night rhythm issue. Is there anyone else on the panel to comment on vitamin D?
I think I just have a question about indoor lighting and UV, whether maybe.
Now, you don't, basically, all fluorescent lighting, they do emit UV, but the glass doesn't let it come out. So the likelihood that you're going to get enough vitamin D production with UV coming from electrical light sources, it's zero. So
Yeah, and just to back that up, in ICUs and other hospitalized settings, the patients are routinely vitamin D deficient.
What about these lights that you sit in front of for depression or?
now it's still the same thing. The bulb has a glass that doesn't emit the UV. The only one are the tanning lamps. Those are different. They don't have that, but that's for the purpose of tanning. So that's why.
We'll take one question
and
from the
wait,
audience.
Just to back you up is to say that we're not always initially talking about shift work. We're talking about everyday people who live indoors are not getting vitamin D, and they're not sleeping, and they're not have artificial light at night.
Yeah.
So we have a mess.
Yeah. Thank you. One statement.
Just a quickie comment. At MGH, for instance, at the hospitals, they're now giving 50,000 units of vitamin D for its other functions. If you want to really look at bone health, you also need to look at the TGF-beta family of bone morphogenic protein 4 and 7, as well as Indian hedgehog. Those are really more predictive of bone health, and now they're using, we've discovered this and produced a product, it's selling billions now, of BMP7 to repair a non-union fractures. So if you want to repair non-union fractures or do spinal fusions, you look at BMPs. If you want to look at immune and other functions of vitamin D, you go to vitamin D.
Thank you. Certainly, there's more research needed in the area of the bone necrosis and vitamin D. Okay, I'm going to move to question number 4 because we do want to try to finish by 2:30. Should sleep, meal timing, and daylight, i.e. vitamin D, be considered confounders or effect modifiers in the clinical research of artificial light at night and shift work? And we go back to the order. And Janet, do you want to make a comment or pass?
So I think this is a hard question for somebody who's not an epidemiologist, but I would say that they're effect modifiers. They're not confounders because they are likely to be important in and of themselves rather than things just to get away from. And so I think that what we want to know is what are the effects, what are the independent and collaborative effects of them rather than trying to get rid of them from the equation.
Thank you. Dr. Panda.
I think I've already said that the meal timing can be a modifier because the food itself drives circadian rhythm and the periphery and various components of food, for example, caffeine and other components also have impact on circadian rhythm. So in that way, at least meal timing should be considered as a modifier.
Thank you. Dr. Smolinski, is it a confounder or modifier? Thank you.
I see the system as circadian organized. I see for what was our ancestors that our drive for food was circadian driven, and sleep was controlled by a circadian oscillator, as were other functions. So I neither see it as a modifier or a confounder. I see it part of the system. I just don't know what would be a normal eating pattern, because just like the life we live today, or it says I lived, like to leave it actually, the life that we live today is so artificial. I really don't know if we were without this kind of living condition, what we would be doing for our food consumption.
Okay.
In terms of patterns.
Fred?
Yeah, I agree. Michael said it probably better than I can say it. I don't consider it a confounder or a modifier. I consider that the sleep disruption, the meal timing, the light at night is causing that, and it's resulting in circadian external desynchronization of our feeding sleep patterns with our central circadian clock, and it's a multidimensional problem, and they're not confounders like alcohol or depression or cigarette smoking, which are higher in shift workers, and therefore we call them confounders to the thing. They're part of the problem. They're the external synchronization, which we've discussed before.
Thank you, Fred. So I'm not letting the rest of you off the hook. I'd like to invite, through show of hands, how many of us at the panel feel that, I think they're saying mediator, is not confounder, not modifier, but mediator? I'm sorry. The question is, should sleep, meal timing, daylight be considered confounders, effect modifiers in human studies of artificial light at night in shift work? Go ahead. Oop.
I think you cannot answer this question without actually specifying what model you're looking at. So it depends on the outcome, what you actually would determine what these things are. I think really that in this kind of research, we really have to go into direct acyclic graphs or to DAX to really think very hard how these things are actually related, if they actually are intermediates or if they are colliders or confounders. And that may really depend on the situation you're looking at. So I don't think there is actually a appropriate answer to this question.
I want to point out one thing very, very quickly. The assumption has been made that shift workers get less sunlight. Night workers, they probably get more.
Okay.
I've got a comment.
Go ahead.
I think that daylight has a potential to be an effect modifier, and I think there's some data out there to suggest that. Bright natural light, in particular, which is rich in blue, in the blue wavelengths, obviously. There's some old data to show that I forget the situation, but at any rate, that Bud might be able to remember the study, but bright natural light can reinforce the nighttime melatonin signal. It certainly can in rodents. There's an old study that shows that rats in a natural environment, natural light, have a more robust nighttime melatonin signal. And we just published a paper not long ago showing that light coming in through blue tinted cages, that we see up to a sevenfold increase in the amplitude of the melatonin signal, and metabolic sequelae in terms of glucose levels, insulin, leptin, corticosterone rhythms and levels that seem to indicate a more, quotes, healthful, whatever that means. And we have a paper now that's in preparation. Actually, it's another paper in prostate cancer that's actually just come out in the same situation where blue light raises the nocturnal level of melatonin, again, sevenfold. And if we look at tumor growth, human prostate cancer xenograft growth under those circumstances, that tumor growth is slowed. It's slowed by the natural melatonin signal, the quotes normal melatonin signal that we see in the laboratory. But this further increase in the amplitude of melatonin leads to a further increase in duration of the melatonin signal. And we see even a further slowdown in tumor growth and metabolism, almost as if you gave the animals a melatonin supplement. So I think there's at least a suggestion out there, some data, that by modifying light during the day, you might be able to reinforce the circadian system, and melatonin in particular.
There's one comment from the audience.
So George Brainerd from Thomas Jefferson University. I agree with what Dr. Blass just said, and actually it was mentioned earlier when Dr. Gorman and Dr. Figueroa mentioned that photic history is critically important. So if you just look at light in the evening and light at night and ignore photic history, what's happened during the day and the days preceding, you're missing a big part of the picture.
Thank you. We're now approaching 2:30. This clock is apparently running a few moments fast. Before I turn it back to Ruth or Wendy or whoever over there, I just want to point out that this workshop appears to be having an impact. According to the NIH Recreation and Welfare Association, just in the last few hours has posted a little article for its members, the NIH staff, saying, headline, "Does timing matter?" And it goes on to discuss the biological clock and how it affects health. I mean, this just happened today. We're constantly watching. I'd like to thank my colleague, Aaron Leplosky, for pointing this out. So I'd like to turn it back to the group. There may be time for more discussion. You guys are calling the clock.
We are actually going to take our last short break because we have the cafeteria is closing soon. So take a 10-minute break, come back, and we'll wrap this up this afternoon. Thank you.